Dr. Nathaniel Barr answers this question. How can we build the workplace of the future in a way that brings out the best in all of us and brings the most value to the world? Amidst the disruption of COVID-19, organizations have been faced with countless challenges, including how to foster an innovative and creative workplace. Dr. Nathaniel Barr's talk, The Essential Elements of the Workplace of the Future, he will share how organizations can turn what seems like a challenge into a prime opportunity to foster ingenuity and productivity in the workplace. Dr. Barr is a scientific advisor at BEworks, where he helps bring behavioral science to bear on the most pressing organizational and societal challenges of this era. He holds a PhD from the University of Waterloo, professor of creativity and creative thinking at Sheridan College. He teaches courses aimed at enhancing creative and innovative potential and holds several federal research grants which leverage behavioral science to solve practical challenges. He has published widely in both academic journals and popular outlets on an array of topics including creativity, innovation, and the intersection of thinking and technology. And Nathaniel Barr's work has been covered in media around the world. And after his keynote, stay tuned for my fireside chat with Dr. Nathaniel Barr.
Thanks for joining us today. Excited to talk to you about the essential elements of the workplace of the future. And of course, when we think about the workplace today, and probably going forward, the most immediate thing that we see in the landscape is COVID-19. The image before you now is COVID-19 virus under an electron microscope. And it's clear that this tiny little thing, this minuscule virus, has brought about disproportionately massive changes to our world. To date, the cases number in the hundreds of millions. We've lost millions of people to the virus. And for the purposes of today's talk, it's worth considering the way that COVID-19 has upended the economy and more broadly, how we connect with each other, both interpersonally and within the workplace. It's clear that these sweeping changes are taking place, and I think it's also clear that quite a few of them are likely to be permanent. Work is probably one of the areas of our lives that has been most disrupted. If you look to some of the data, for example, from Stats Canada, we see a massive increase in the number of workers performing their duties from home. Whereas only 4% were working from home in 2016, from April 2020 to June 2021, almost 1/3 of workers were working mostly from home. Of course, this differs across sectors. We see majority, somewhere around 7 in 10 of people in finance, insurance, professional services, whereas only about 5% of people in things like food services. And of course, we can't forget our friends and colleagues in the healthcare system who have been out on the front lines, helping us overcome the challenges before us. Not only has this pandemic disrupted what exactly we're doing each day and where we're doing it, it's led to some questioning of the fundamental assumptions around what work should be like. For example, there was a recent article in The Atlantic penned by Ed Zitron that told us to say goodbye to our manager, identifying perhaps the shortcomings in our organizational structuring such that we have a bit too much administrative bloat and not enough people working directly. Whether that comes to be, we shall see. And not only is it changing perhaps where we are, what we're doing, and maybe who is overseeing us, it's also dynamically altered the way that people feel about their work. For example, one of the really influential pieces coming out of the pandemic discourse was one by fellow psychologist Adam Grant, wherein he identified languishing as the dominant emotion of the pandemic, this sense of stagnation and emptiness. And this is translated into people making interesting career choices. Another New York Times piece written by Kevin Roos called Welcome to the YOLO Economy describes this rising trend, particularly amongst relatively well-off corporate workers, where they're just giving up the gig and going off to start their own thing, desiring some influx of flexibility and making them question, what is it I'm doing in an office for my whole life? Maybe there's something more out there. To sum some of this up, there seems to be disruption both to traditional operations, boiling down to even office real estate and how many desks we need. But there's also a sense that there's some influence on aspects of recruitment and retention and other HR-related issues. So for example, Deloitte relatively recently came out saying that all their staff could work from home forever. Other giants in the industrial landscape like Google, Microsoft, Twitter, and a whole host of others have also suggested to their employees that things will not be the same. You might have seen there's open discourse today around whether relocating to a less centralized location for work demands the same high salaries that you might get in a major hub. So when we look to what people are thinking about this, we can see outsized opinions in what they think they should be doing on the daily basis. So for example, the World Economic Forum conducted a survey, and most people indicated they did want flexibility in where and when and how they work. And almost a third of the people surveyed said they would quit their job if they were forced to return to the office full time. So to think this through, it's obvious that things have changed. What remains unclear, though, is what the essential elements of the workplace of the future will be, beyond a few obvious tasks. So the other thing worth considering, though, is that while COVID-19 has served as a catalytic agent and propelled the rate of change to become faster, it's also worth remembering that these winds of change were blowing strong long before the virus came along. In particular, we see this through the technological revolutions that are underway across all aspects of society. To characterize these changes and what has been called the Fourth Industrial Revolution, Klaus Schwab, founder and executive chairman of the World Economic Forum, states that we stand on the brink of a technological revolution that will fundamentally alter the way we live, work, and relate to one another. This obviously isn't the first, given I've said it's the fourth industrial revolution, but just think back. In the late 1700s, we saw steam and water technology change the way that manufacturing and transportation occurred, fundamentally altering the lives of millions of people. Late 1800s, we saw the onset of electricity and another rise in rapid industrialization, transforming the economy and the way that people lived. The third industrial revolution in the late 60s came about mostly due to the ability to effectively manufacture things like semiconductors, mainframe computers, and we saw information technology rise to be an absolutely integral part of nearly every industry. Today, as we enter the fourth industrial revolution, we're seeing this unique fusion of new technologies and their interaction across the physical, digital, and biological domains. We've been here before, but in some ways, it seems that this is an unprecedented revolution. The velocity at which change is happening seems faster than ever. The breadth and depth, the way that we're seeing fundamental, deep changes as well as very wide-ranging changes seems unparalleled according to many experts. And we're seeing perhaps unparalleled systems impact in which nearly every aspect of society and the economy is seeing disruption as a consequence of these technologies. So what are we looking at? Been a bit vague on that so far. When we think about the fourth industrial revolution, we're seeing things like AI, most central, advanced robotics, autonomous vehicles, the Internet of Things, blockchain, 3D printing. How about a shout out to mRNA vaccines? We're seeing synthetic biological advances, things like gene editing that were once the stuff of science fiction. If you want to wrap your head around perhaps my favorite bizarre technological progression, I implore you to Google xenobots, which variably might be called synthetic life forms or biological robots. So in thinking about the impacts of this, I think it's worth noting that Schwab, despite these movements being predicated upon technology, really focuses in on the human element in describing what's happening, the way we live, work, and relate to one another. I think there's a commonality with COVID-19 in that though the pandemic is operating at the microscopic level, its true impacts are at the level of behavior. And we can see that both due to this pandemic and the technological shifts underway, that connecting, communicating, collaborating, creating, working together will not be staying the same. In thinking through what the implications are in the years to come, I point you to some fantastic work out of RBC Thought Leadership describing the coming creativity boom, how human ingenuity will power the 2020s. So on one hand, while these challenges that we face within industry and society are clear, and it's obvious that we need to derive solutions so as not to fall behind, this piece argues that we should also be open to imagining the vast opportunities for improvement that have presented themselves. In this piece, they describe a vision for the soaring 20s, an era punctuated by novel and adaptive thinking, and an opportunity to reimagine the future of behavior, including how we work. For example, they cite LinkedIn data that creativity is the top skill of this era. We need this novel and useful solution generation that will help economic recovery and an adjustment to the new realities of the working world. They suggest towards the conclusion of this report that we're ready to enter an exciting age of ideas. So how do I feel about this argument? I think they're spot on. However, I do think we need to go further. In articulating why I think we need to go further, I'll point you to a now classic HBR article by Theodore Levitt, longtime Harvard Business School professor. He penned an essay entitled "Creativity is Not Enough." And this was around the time that there was a bit of a boom in the industrial adoption of creative problem-solving techniques, similar to what we're seeing called for today. But Levitt differed a bit in that he thought maybe it's the idea generation that's the easy part. So to quote Levitt, "Ideation is relatively abundant. Implementation is more scarce." And he argued that many advocates for creativity have failed to distinguish between the relatively easy process of being creative in the abstract and the infinitely more difficult process of being innovationist in the concrete. So, to go beyond this age of ideas, we need an age of creative implementation, and that necessitates a framework for innovation. Now, various scholars and management thinkers have advocated for a whole litany of approaches to driving innovation, but I'll point you now to BEworks co-founder and CEO Kelly Peters. In spring 2020, the Rotman Management magazine put forth a special issue on behavioral insights, and therein Kelly articulated a vision wherein behavioral science can provide that framework for innovation that we discussed, critically offering a means of propelling creative ideas into action that is measurable, observable, and testable. This requires a vantage that prizes scientific rigor over opinion or intuition. So, in order for you to more completely apprehend what it means for behavioral science to be a framework for innovation, we can look to the BEworks method. The BEworks method is a three-phased approach, and this has been developed by Kelly and her colleagues over many years of solving practical challenges in field. So, what does it look like? It looks like a successive turn through research phases, which then inform new strategy and solutions, and those new strategies and solutions are rolled out and subjected to impact evaluation through the rigorous methods of science. So let me walk you through this a little bit. The research phase first begins with really getting the story straight between organizational leaders about which measurable, observable behaviors are trying to be changed and how you might measure them. We find in our experience that there's often a gulf between the rhetorical, high-level discussions around, yeah, we should increase trust, for instance, and the actual agreement within a room about what we're even talking about when we use the word trust. So the first thing you need to do is get these definitions straight and how you might measure it. Once this is established, we can move into diagnosing the behavior that is influencing decisions in the workplace. And this is where you need experts on research and decision-making and behavior, because oftentimes these take the form of biases, beliefs, attitudes, and experiences. So the more we can map out current state behavior, understand the cognitive or emotional biases happening within our workforce, then we can derive effective solutions that overcome these barriers. Once we have an understanding of these barriers, next we can generate hypotheses about how we might overcome these barriers to the desired behaviors we wish to see. So this is the phase where the famous idea of nudge comes into play, as does our creativity. We're able to draw insights from the scientific literature on previously successful behavioral interventions, plus use our intuition, experience, and creativity to come up with solutions that have not been tried. Once we've prioritized the ideas that we think warrant a foray into the field, we can put them to the test in this third phase of impact evaluation. Randomized controlled trials are probably the best option, in which you randomly assign people to control or experimental groups where they either get this, that, or the other thing. But there's many ways that we could discuss that we can empirically, rigorously detect whether strategies and solutions we're trying have positive impact. From there, once you're armed with this understanding of what worked, what didn't, and perhaps why, then we can try and scale these things across an organization. And this process really drives innovation quite directly through the amount of risk-taking we're able to take. If we're trying several strategies concurrently and seeing which one works best, oftentimes we can push the limits and do something that's perhaps a bit more out there. So to contextualize a bit more what it means to take a behavioral lens, let's quickly look at a few of the dominant questions that are dominating discourse amongst today's organizational leaders. In 2018, Kelly and I wrote a piece for behavioral scientists looking at the rise of the augmented worker. And the big question at hand is, how can firms get the benefits of AI without erasing uniquely human strengths? What we mean by augmented workers is human intelligence supported by artificial intelligence. Of course, to do this through the BEworks method, we need to break this down, but you can see, just as an example, imagine the decision aids that we see taking hold in areas like medical diagnostics and financial trading, where augmenting human decision-making with artificial intelligence aids can improve our performance. So here, the key measurable observable behavior is our willingness to take into account AI suggestions in our decision making. We must overcome things like overconfidence and general resistance to technology. And so if it is the case these aids are better than us alone, we need to build and test creative interventions that overcome these barriers to getting us to adopt these algorithmic aids into our decision making. And in concluding, it's worth pointing out that the critical thing here is that we may have ideas for how to do this, but this isn't a race to the finish. The pace of technological change today is suggestive that we're going to continually have to experiment and innovate. And this is a battle for the optimization of extended human ability. And in our view, to win that battle, we must use behavioral science. How about something more related to COVID-19? Early in the pandemic in 2020, a number of us got our heads together and thought about what it means for work from home in the behavioral sense. So we articulated a vision that if we could account for these behavioral concerns, we might usher in a new era of prosperity and well-being in the workforce. We rattled off a few ideas. Of course, there's many more. Things like trust, creativity, connection, collaboration, and psychological safety seem paramount. And of course, the literature does have insights for us on how to help this situation. So, as an example, if employers think leaders don't trust them, they're less productive and engaged. But we also know that transparency and openness of information can help foster a sense of trust, perhaps a direct solution. How about collaboration? We've lost that constant communication that is possible in person when we can point across and wave someone over across the office. However, research from the Academy of Management Journal shows that bursty communication might be best. By that we mean, rather than constantly communicate, you have flurries of activity when needed and then periods of silence. So maybe we just need to calibrate our expectations. One that is particularly relevant to me is creativity. A lot of people feared that we lose some of these original ideas that we see due to a lack of collaborative collisions. You know, there's not that spontaneous ideation that occurs collaboratively. But research actually shows that brainstorming alone and then coming together in a group to discuss might produce better ideas. Likewise, there's evidence to suggest that electronic brainstorming done through various apps can get around some of the social dynamic impediments to the best ideas. For example, the loudest person in the room, which is never me, taking over the discourse within a brainstorming session. So this provides some useful starting points, but it's wise to remember that contexts and companies are unique and times change. So as much as I can point you to some of the relevant research, these should be conceived as ideational starting points that can then become hypotheses, which then can be prototyped and developed into solutions, and then we subject to the rigor of science. To give you a real example of something we're doing today at BEworks, consider our office. As the restrictions have abated and the risk seems to be reducing, it's possible for people to return to the office. In the true spirit of science, however, rather than just go with what seems to be the most optimal arrangement based on our intuition, we're rolling out the BEworks open house plan. People are free to come and go, use the office as they wish, and we'll be collecting data on how many people come in, how they choose to use that time, and as well, we'll launch surveys looking at whether people are meeting their needs psychologically, as well as whether this is conducive to meeting our organizational goals. So rather than going in with a specific idea based on what we think, we're going to collect data in a rigorous way and try and make an informed evidence-based choice and allow us to learn what model works best under what circumstances. So we've covered a lot of ground here thinking about the essential elements of the workplace of the future. And as we collectively prognosticate, I think we can all agree that it's evident that things will be changing. What is driving this is clearly the COVID-19 pandemic today, and in the slightly longer history of our species, the fourth industrial revolution rising to the fore. And this has changed not just how we work, it changed how we feel about work, and those technological advances have also provided new potential for imagining completely different models of work and workplaces. So in thinking through that big question of what are the essential elements of the workplace, I think it's clear that it will be technologically advanced, it should be flexible, it should be adaptive, it should be creative, and I think that the best workplaces of the future will be informed and grounded by the science of behavior. Thank you.